just a little bit, just to hammer out some facts on what's going on in Cuba. The Cuban people are protesting like crazy. The main things that have, at least they've publicly come to us in terms of their why they're protesting, has been lack of food, lack of access to COVID vaccines, or just like mishandling of COVID in general. And then there's now been, I think the last final straw was these blackouts or electricity shortages. And they have gotten more access to the internet in recent years, starting a little bit in 2014 and really accelerating 2018. Historically, we have always had an embargo on Cuba because we don't like communism in the United States. We don't think it should exist. Bad things happen. At least that's been our stance on it. So like since 1960, we've been putting embargo with trade. We don't allow trade to happen between Cuba and the United States besides food and medicine. And that's fluctuated in a number of different ways. Obama eased this in 2014, which is why you saw more internet access in Cuba and a little more tourism. And Trump came in and revoked it, said absolutely not. And Biden hasn't touched it yet.
And this is an important thing to focus on for a minute, the Obama easing it, because something that I've heard and that makes a lot of sense to me is you had this hope start to exist in Cuba when Obama came in and eased the restrictions and opened the way for tourism and opened their economy, or helped their economy in that way. And what's happened over the last year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever it's been, was like a walk back of that hope. And there is there's a pattern in like international affairs where revolutions start when things start to get a little better and then get worse again.
The haves become the have-nots.
It's not just abject poverty or abject misery. It's when people start to think things might get better and then that gets pulled back from them. Right. That's when you start to see, in many ways, what we're seeing, which is for the first time, you have people in Cuba acknowledging that they're living under a dictatorship. For years, they couldn't even say that publicly, or they were too afraid to say that publicly because it was taboo. And the other thing I want to point out, and then we can continue on with this narrative, is there's really three things that have happened recently. You had Trump reimposing stricter sanctions, embargoes, et cetera, on the country after Obama. You also have the collapse of Venezuela, and Venezuela was
Venezuela came in when we were not giving them any like trade or
aid specifically Venezuela provided them with heavily subsidized oil, so they were reliant on heavily subsidized oil from Venezuela, and that sort of collapsed. And then you have COVID obviously hit. So these three factors sort of all hit at once, on top of existing struggles, frankly, because of communism, because you have 88% of the population working for the government, because you have essentially planned economy, because you don't have private markets. And that's been devastating.
Yep. And so I'm fascinated by this narrative because no one's really talking about it. I don't think we can actually say for certain that this is the case. But if I'm as a political strategist, this is where my head is at, that Obama was like, okay, let's ease this up. Let's help the Cuban, like the embargo that the U.S. has put on Cuba is hurting the people of Cuba. I mean, like it's less money in the country, right? Less everything. So Obama eases it. Trump puts it back. Theoretically, Biden could quickly say, "Hey, we're going back to what we did in the Obama era." I mean, he could do that, right? However, the big, and we mentioned this earlier in this podcast, is the big factor here no one's been talking about is the reason Biden lost Florida is because of Cuban Americans that do not like living in Miami, Dade County, that do not like the Cuban government and are in Miami because they want an escape from that. And by the way, if like you look at the numbers in Florida, they thought Duval County, where Jacksonville is, if they flip that blue, they're going to win because Miami is always Democratic. And Miami did go Democrat, but it was less. It's usually like 80-20. I think it was 60-40 Dem Republican. And that's massive. And if I would say like if that keeps shrinking, there's no chance of winning Florida for the Dems realistically anytime soon. So there's that piece of this puzzle, which I think is fascinating in this narrative.
And you've got Biden coming out, the Biden administration and his spokesfolks are coming out saying like, hey, it's just that it's first things first for us right now. We're focusing on COVID recovery, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just not a top priority for us right now. That's their talking point for why they're not going back to Obama era policies, I think your take is obviously very interesting. And, there's been arguments that that's why Trump did what he did, was he made the announcement about renewed sanctions on Cuba in Miami-Dade County, like to a group of Cuban Americans, while he's hammering how socialist the Democrats are. So it's a tragic situation. I don't like the embargo. I don't think it's helpful. I think it is just hurting the people of Cuba. I think we have a better shot of getting Cuba to call it, I would say, modernize. I'm sure that'll piss people off, but by building these bridges to Cuba, which was what Obama was trying to do. But there are clearly all sorts of political considerations that beyond just the Cuban people.
I have two questions that I think I'd like to wrap up this topic on. One, I want to talk about the future of the party in general, and then I want to talk about how we as consumers of media can navigate this, because that's the goal of this. So let's start with the future of the party. We kind of touched on this a bit. I think the pressure, I guess I'll start my opinion on this. I think the pressure from the DSA type candidates is going to increase, not decrease, because it's good news fodder. It's good material, right? Where Black Lives Matter is coming out and saying we support the people of Cuba, but we also blame the U.S. government for doing this. You have DSA saying something similar. You end up with Bernie and co. all trying to thread this needle, but it keeps this social, we like socialism, we don't like all of it. In the headlines, and the Republicans will always keep adding fuel to this fire, because anytime they hear the word socialism, they're like, "Oh, that's the devil."
This is how they win elections. This is their just hammer it all day long, baby.
So I think the Republicans will continue in elections by this, because I think the average American doesn't like socialism. But do you think that starts to shift, or do you think the Dems start getting more wins in here, or the 4 candidates have happened, you might get to 8 to 10 in Congress, but that they start becoming the exception, not the rule? What are your thoughts on where it goes?
It depends on what they decide to focus on. If these candidates keep their message about Medicare for all and our current economic system is unfair without
Wealth
suggesting
inequality.
if they keep it on that, I think you'll see a lot more traction. I think where it gets muddied is you have a lot of people who are in that vein also adopt a lot of talking points around identity, race, justice, on that stuff. And whatever you think, obviously I'm actually in favor of a lot of that, but I think the talking points around them are often very unhelpful for winning elections. If you continue to see that side of things really bleed into the economic side of things, I think you'll continue to have what you have, which is pockets of this succeeding, but by and large, the country actually reacting very much against it and going the other direction. If you have candidates that are sticking strictly to the economics of it, which was really Bernie in 2016, that was more his lane, I think you could see more traction in a way that I actually support. How about you? I
think, and this is probably answer my second question too, how we should consume this. To me, I think the data is very overwhelming, and the historical anecdotes are overwhelming, that socialism, in the way it's traditionally defined, is bad. It is a bad thing. It's never worked. The way, if you're consuming these media, the way that AOC and Bernie and others are talking about socialism, they are using that term, so that can be scary, but they're not fun. Theoretically, they're not always talking about. They're more talking about Sweden, Norway, Denmark than they are talking about.
Which
Cuba,
means
Venezuela,
socializing certain industries like
right.
healthcare. Side note, Sweden, for example, has private health insurance in addition to public.
I think the way, and I think what all of us as consumers need to try and understand, that when this term is thrown around on both sides of the aisle, there's different definitions that people are using, and it's important to try to understand what they mean. But I think the real future is, I think India Walton, who's the woman who just won the Democratic primary in Buffalo for mayor, beating at least 2-term incumbent. Now I love Buffalo. Go Bills. Love you, Josh Allen. But I don't live in Buffalo. I don't claim to know enough about this race. But what I do know, it appears that she ran her race not on I'm a socialist, but more on power to the people, and that people on the ground are closest to these issues can solve them. And it was issue focused, but from the American. She's not calling for an end to capitalism or end to free markets, but more about stopping people piling up at the bottom. This populist version of this. And I think that's the lane, because capitalism has a ton of benefits, but people will pile up at the bottom, and it's the government's job to kind of figure this out and level the playing field in its own way. And great policies can do that.